So hi, my name is Amanda. I am new to OSU. I've been here about 13 months, and I am a data management services librarian. Show of hands, how many of you have ever worked with a data librarian before? Oh, I see. Oh, yes, I remember. Hi. I think I saw a hand over there. Oh, great, wonderful. So, um, data librarians are new. We're a new type of position that's growing up in libraries. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you'll kind of get a feel for why the library is involved. Um, my previous background is not as a librarian. I'm actually a former USDA agricultural researcher. So I'm very quantitatively based in sort of my first career and have moved more social science as I move into librarianship. So you'll see, if you hear me talk about analogies, they tend to be biology based. Maybe today I'll get some alternatives. So I start all my talks by defining data. In the old days, when I trained up in my first career, data was numbers. Now this word has been co-opted by several other communities, and really research data can be anything. And that makes it terrifically difficult to talk about. So I always start every conversation with the definition. What I mean by data is whatever collection of stuff you do research on. It can be print, digital, artifacts, all of that can be considered your data. And thank you so much for introducing this as a process, because I think that is one of the hard things to grasp. Um, I like life cycles being biology based, so I'm going to throw a bunch of them up here, and I hope you like them too. This is just one version of what we call the data life cycle. It's sort of embedded there with a number of steps. Hopefully you recognize your process here. You start out with your proposal, you start your project, you get the funding, collect some data, analyze it, you got those surveys out there. And when you work through the entire process yourself, you probably know exactly what you do in the next step. Hopefully today, what you'll be able to look at is how you do your work, and then what we talk about, what you can apply at which stages. And this is a little different for everyone. So if this doesn't look exactly like your process, hopefully it's similar enough that you can draw some relations. Does anyone think this deviates a lot from what they do? I saw some heads shaking in the back. If you analyze secondary data, if you find data and analyze it from other people, sometimes they can say, well, my process looks very different, and sometimes that can be very true. So this is just one potential representation. So why are librarians talking to you about your data? Usually it's statisticians, right? Statisticians or IT personnel talking to you about where you can put it, what you can do with it, how you analyze it. When the federal funding agencies got together and decided that they really wanted researchers to share their data, this is around 2000, a couple of seminal reports came out. And one of them said, we can have all the statisticians in the room and all the IT people in the room, but they're not going to know how to appropriately share the information in such a way that another human understands it. And so they kind of looked around and said, well, who does that? Who shares information in such a way that other humans can pick it up and reuse it? And that's how librarians got involved. So data librarians tend to be heavily driven by the federal funding agencies and their requirements. And in these first few slides, I'm going to hit that kind of hard. There's a couple of reasons for that, most of which is that a number of them are coming up, and I want you to be prepared. So just a couple of people. You want to volunteer? Who funds you? Who's a majority funder in this area? Okay, good. So I guessed right then, right? IES actually is a new one for me. They've had a lot about data sharing in there, but they've just expanded that. So I got to do my first consult in the last week on them. So in February of 2013, OSTP, the Office for Science and Technology Policy, sent a memo to all of their funding agencies that give out more than 100 million, I believe, in research funds. And they said, in the next year, you're going to come up with a public access plan. and you're going to make it public. In the last 6 months, this is everyone who's come out with a public access plan or has expanded their existing one. So you can see there's quite a few new funding agencies in the game. Usually these public access plans pertain to both your articles and your data sets, but since I'm the data librarian, I'm only going to talk about data. If you want to talk about articles, I'm happy to do that afterwards. So essentially, a lot of these new policies are asking you to have a data management plan. How many people here have had one of those? Okay, so I see a couple of hands. That's fine. like, I'm thrilled that there's one there and you know the phrase. And yes, exactly. I'm going to show you a brilliant tool too. So when I'm at home sleeping, you can be at 3 in the morning writing your data management plan. The plan is just that. It is a plan for your data. The difficulty of this is everyone has very unique workflows, processes, and types of data. They fall under different regulations, and each one of your plans is going to be pretty unique, right? And they might ask you to consider things that you haven't considered in the past. So this is sort of a heads up FYI. This is coming down later this year. We expect we still have 5 or 6 more agencies out there that haven't released anything. The trend, as you can see, is that they want a data management plan. They're going to start enforcing it probably at the end of this year. Their language is encouraging you to share your data. So, who here deposits their data somewhere and shares it? That's usually the sticking point. So I won't get into that quite yet because that's at the end, but just be aware that in the plan, you're asked to basically project into the future what you're going to do. So my goal as a data librarian is to help you think through that before you even submit your grant proposal. And that's kind of a hard thing to do, but if we can do it well, it makes the rest of it much easier. I'll tell you right now, these are the 6 major things that they ask for in all these plans. In my workshops, I sometimes go part by part and explain them, but just to give you an idea of what they're going to ask you to address. Does anyone see anything on here that is wildly concerning at the moment? I think we're going to talk about a few of these later. Okay, you'll probably see that slide again. So to bring us back to our process, the process represents your reality, hopefully, or close enough. The data management plan sort of looks like this process, but when you start to map it, it appears completely arbitrary. This is something that's really hard to put together when you're in that crisis stage of getting that proposal in before a deadline. So ideally today, when you hear other people talk about their data and you see these diagrams, hopefully you'll sort of be able to put together that this really is a whole life cycle. Even though the government's going to ask you to talk about the life cycle in different ways and in different parts of your grant. Chances are you talk about your analysis, but you're not going to talk about your analysis in your data management plan. You're going to talk about how you collect your data and possibly how you share your data, or why you don't share your data. And so this kind of throws a lot of people off. It doesn't flow the way we actually do our research. So hopefully, if you can kind of behind the scenes put those pieces together, it's not so odd when you have to sit down and articulate it. So I primarily like to deliver tools because right now there's one of me at OSU and there's more than one of you out there. So if you have to write a data management plan, one of the first things I did when I got here is we configured a lovely piece of software for you. Yes, I think so too. It's called dmptool.org. You log in with your name .number. The first time you log in, it's going to ask you to fill out a little profile, nothing too arduous. And after that, you have an account. So essentially, you all have accounts already pre-set up. You just log into it. You select what agency and which directorate you're applying to, and it will walk you through the process of every heading you're supposed to address, links to the actual instructions for that heading, along with sort of questions if you want to do a question answer kind of thing. There's links to OSU specific policies. Certainly when you're asked to talk about your obligations, I highly recommend throwing all the policies in there. And as well, if you go up to that contact Amanda Reinhardt, you can email me directly from this software. Am I going in and out? So hopefully I haven't panicked you too much about data management plans coming your way, and you have a tool here that will help you through it, and you can always talk to me too. So I'm going to turn it over now. Sure.
Let's assume, my name is Michelle Fennessy. I'm from the College of Nursing, and I'm an assistant professor. So assume I am submitting a grant to NINR as part of the NIH, okay, National Institute of Nursing Research. Could I then go to your tool and then select NIH and it would bring up the specific requirements?
Yes. So if a directorate under an agency has a different set of sub-requirements, you'll see it drop down. The NIH does not. So you would just go back up to your agency and use that one. The NSF, on the other hand, has like 8 or 10 different directorate-specific instructions. So then you would go NSF, it drops down, maybe your social and behavior sciences. And then you would go into that subheading. So the question was, is this something we should do when we're in the middle of our grants? I get this question every once in a while. So some agencies are asking in annual reports from grants that are transitioning for little updates on the data, but so far it has not been required that you do a data management plan. I kind of encourage people to go from here forward because often data has a real volume issue, and certainly data in the past is very large and complex. So I would encourage you to go from this point forward. Okay, so I am turning this over to Dr. David Bloom.
Thank you. How many of you can hear me without the microphone?
The camera can't.
Yeah, the camera can't.
I don't care about the camera. Because it's easier for me to talk without the microphone than with the microphone, so having been a middle school and high school teacher for a while, I think my voice is probably loud enough, so I'm going to do it that way. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I feel a bit out of my element because it's unusual for an ethnographer to come in and talk to a bunch of people who are primarily interested in quantitative analysis of data and a very different paradigm. So if you will, view this as your comic relief moment in the workshop. So I'm going to talk about thinking about data management from a very different sort of perspective. And I'm going to try to think about power slides from a different perspective too. There we go. All right, so this is how I'd like to organize my talk. I'm going to make a few comments on the DMP tool, some background on the research that I do. I'm going to talk about the nature of video-enhanced ethnographic research. I'm going to talk about why storage is actually not storage, but interpretation. I'm going to talk about some ethical considerations, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about the Center for Video Ethnography and Discourse Analysis so that you can understand one model that ethnographers, the people who do ethnographic research, might use for thinking about data management and some of the issues involved there. So if you go to the DMP tool, and in my case, much of the funding that I've received throughout my career has come from first the National Institute of Education, when IES was called that, way back when. I clicked on to, oh, Okay, so we have no match between here and there. Okay, well you've got the handout, right? And you can see the paper copies of the slides. So you will see these various aspects, and many of them are some of the same things that you would see required by our OSU IRB, and there's some additional things in there as well. Now, all of this is actually quite useful, even for people who do qualitative research to think about, and ethnographic research. But what I want to suggest is that none of this goes far enough if you want to do high-quality research, at least high-quality ethnographic research. And so I'm actually going to talk beyond all of what's there. There's a lot of interesting and very helpful information there, but I want to talk beyond it. So let me begin by talking with you about some of the research that I do and how I do my research, because I think that many of you in here don't know much about ethnography or ethnographic research and what it is. And for you it may be somewhat different in terms of what I do. So ethnographic research is primarily interested in describing and understanding cultural phenomena. And we're trying to understand cultural phenomena from the point of view, if you will, from an emic perspective, the point of view and perspective of the people who are actually doing it, rather than our own perspective. So that means when I'm going to look at a classroom, I'm trying to understand this classroom as a culture, or if you will, as a subculture. And I'm trying to understand it not from my point of view as a researcher who knows everything, but rather understand it from the perspective of the teachers and students and staff members who are actually in that classroom, living that classroom, embodying that classroom, and making that classroom a classroom. That's really hard to do, because it means I've got to do a lot of things in order to understand it from somebody else's perspective. And you can't just go interview people. Come interview me, if you will, about our family life. I'm going to tell you, it's just absolutely wonderful, right? All right, so and there's a whole lot about my family life I live every day that I don't actually even know myself. So, you know, trying to understand things from an emic perspective, which means an insider perspective, is really hard to do, and you can't just go ask people about it. That would be nice, but it's not enough. Helpful, yes. Enough, nowhere near. So that's some of what I try to do in the research that I do. And it takes a lot of time. I typically spend a whole year in a classroom in order to understand it, right? Sometimes I spend 2 years in a school to understand it. So I am there a lot. I am there so much they think I'm part of the furniture. I am there so much that they think I belong. They find it unusual when I'm not there. That's because you actually have to live with the culture you're trying to understand. And you have to live with it over time, because time makes a whole lot of difference, right? So, there we go, right there. So I end up working on intensive case studies. So it'll be a case study of a classroom, a case study of a teacher in a school, a case study of a school, having spent a huge amount of time there. I do lots of video recording. Not all ethnographers do lots of video recording, but I tend to do a lot of video recording. I'll have 40, 50, 60 videos from a particular classroom, from just one classroom. So I have a large corpus of data. I do lots of interviews all the time with people that I audio record, and I collect lots of artifacts. I remember one study I did, I sat in the back of the classroom, I saw the kids passing notes around. So I wrote a note. I watched how they passed the notes. They don't just pass notes. They write a note, then you gotta fold the paper in just the right way with little corners and so forth, and then you have to drop it so the teacher doesn't know and I have to pick it up. So I watched them real carefully for about a week doing that, and then I wrote a note. And my note said, "Would you please pass me your notes?" So I folded it all the right ways and so forth, and I dropped mine just like I saw them. And you could have, you know, all the kids are quiet in the classroom anyway because they look like they're looking at the teacher, but they ain't, right? So I dropped my note, and you could have, you know, everybody knew at the moment I dropped my note in just the right way that I had done that. And I could see the kids looking at each other, referencing me. So somebody finally picked up my note, and my note went all the way around the classroom. At the end of that period, one of the students, I don't know how, brought me all of their notes that they had been passing around, okay? So this is part of getting artifacts. Artifacts might be notes. Sometimes some of my research has involved going into homes and families and communities, and also some archives. There's a wonderful archive in England called the Mass Observation Archive, but I'll talk about that at another time. So this is some of the research you do, and as you can see, it's quite different. It's quite different than the research that someone does when they are trying some intervention to see if an intervention works, trying to see if there's an effect of some kind of quantitative size in what they do, trying to understand change in terms of degree of change or quantity of change. I'm not interested particularly in quantity of change. I'm interested in the quality of what is going on, the quality of things that evolve, how things change, the nature of culture and the nature of cultural change within classrooms and in lots of other places. Okay, as part of ethnographic research, one of the key concepts and key issues is this notion of context. Context does not mean what's around. I know that's what everybody thinks it means. You've got something and we can say, what's the context of this? And hold it, that's not really the way we think about context. The way we think about context is context includes this, it includes everything around it and how they all interact with each other. And that there are multiple levels of context and they all interact with each other all at the same time. So it's an awareness of how things are interconnected with each other at multiple layers and at multiple levels. And we try to engage in thickly describing this context. That becomes very important. And this context becomes a frame for interpretation. If you came into my family and you just came in and you saw some of the conversation that was going on, you would say, what is wrong with this family? Why are they always so mean to each other? Well, you would have to have been there a long time to know that if you say something nice to somebody, that's an insult. Because, right, that's the way my family is. That's the context, okay? Right? So you have to understand all of that. All right? So context becomes part of the frame of interpretation. I'm going to come back to this notion of context because it's critically important. And I want to talk about definitions of data. I was really glad that you brought that up. Because in ethnographic research, people always get this confused and wrong. The data is in the being there. I know this is a strange idea, but the data is in the being there. The data are the events themselves. All the rest, the field notes, the videos, the materials, are representations of the data and are themselves interpretations. All right, so we'll boil this all down real quickly. You're sitting there in a classroom. You've all sat in classrooms before. You're sitting there in a classroom. What do you decide to pay attention to? Whatever you decide, that's an interpretation of what's important to look at. So you're immediately confronted with an interpretation. What do you decide to take field notes on? What words do you use to take these field notes on? All of these are acts of interpretation. So you're immediately engaged in interpretation. You decide you're going to video. I don't know about anybody else. I don't know about this camera here, but the cameras I use can't get the whole classroom. Right? You can only get part. How do you decide what you're going to take, what you're not going to take? Right? In your video camera. Who are you going to mic? Who you're not going to mic? From whose perspective you're going to shoot? All of this is interpretation. So it's a representation of the data. It is not the data itself. This is a very important thing to remember. Because I don't know how we share being there. Right? That's really hard to share. Okay? What's a corpus of data look like? Well, I'm using data in a real weird sense. I should have put quotes around it because it's really what does a corpus of representations of data look like. So I'm just going to use data for shorthand right now, but now you know what I mean by it. It means huge numbers of video, hundreds of pages of field notes, lots of artifacts. So if I'm in a classroom, I maybe collect everything students write from all year long. So if it's a classroom of 25 or 30 people and they're each writing an average of 1 or 2 things a day, you calculate how many pieces of paper that is, right? And all sorts of interviews with teachers, students, and anybody else who doesn't mind talking with me. And you can see it's a huge corpus of data. All right? But here's the thing. For anybody to take any one piece of that data out of that corpus and interpret it and look at it without understanding the context of which it was a part is to distort that piece of data. Right? Context is critical, absolutely critical to understanding the culture of that classroom, or if it's some other place, that as well. So the importance of this huge corpus of data is to help preserve context over time, even for the people who did the research themselves, like me, right? To help preserve context. The data itself must also be indexed. So imagine on a project, I've got 50 some odd videotapes of 50 classroom sessions, right? And I'm really interested in looking at how students' understanding of reading evolved over the year. Okay, that's an interesting thing to take a look at. If I haven't indexed my videotapes, I've got to go back and look at all 50, and it's all real time looking at them. That's at least a couple weeks worth doing it. So you index all of your videotapes before you store them, right? So you store them and you organize them. All of that's a form of interpretation that's layered on them. In my work, my research questions evolve, and this data is needed to address evolving research questions. So a friend of mine once said, the difference between ethnographic research and other paradigms is other paradigms start with a research question and they expect to answer it. Ethnographic research starts with a research question that it expects to abandon as soon as possible. And when you get your data, you begin asking questions like, what questions can this data answer? Okay? Now there's this thing called salvage ethnography that I'm sure many of you have not heard of. What does salvage ethnography mean? Well, it means after you get done with your research study, you've got this huge corpus of data. It may suddenly occur to you that, oh, here's a really interesting thing I might look at in this corpus of data. Well, I'm glad I got a whole lot of other data that I didn't think I needed at the beginning, because now I need them to answer this question. Does that make sense to you? Okay? So as ethnographers, we're always keeping in mind the notion that we might want to engage in salvage ethnography at some point later, maybe a year later, 2 years later, or 3 years later, or more. Okay. Let me talk about some ethical considerations from the framework that I have just shared with you and the kind of research I've shared with you. I always need to think about, and ethnographers always need to think about the relations of the context of production to the context of representation, to the context of use and consumption. All right, so the first thing is the word context. I've got to be very careful about how anybody takes any piece of data I've got and tries to understand it without the context within which it occurred. Because let's face it, we have some really mean colleagues out there. They will take a piece of data about a teacher and they will trash that teacher from one end to another and not care a whit. And I'm sorry to say, but it happens, and it happens frequently, right? Yet, if you took that same behavior and understood it in the context in which it occurred, you might have a whole different interpretation and appreciation for what that teacher was doing, right? I've seen it happen. I've seen teachers, a video of a teacher giving a lecture, dominating the floor. I've seen researchers take that video and talk about how dominating the teacher was, how teacher-centered, how much he hated kids, was against student voice and so forth. Yet, if they had understood the whole context, they would have seen that this teacher engaged in all sorts of those kinds of activities that were student-centered on other days. And this was setting up something that was happening elsewhere, right? We've got to be very careful about context and preserving context and making sure that the context of production ends up being in the context that is involved in use and the context of consumption as well. That, I believe, is an ethical and moral obligation that ethnographers have, and I think it's an obligation that all researchers have. Long-term protection of human subjects, okay? I don't think it's enough just to think about the fact that we're protecting them while we're doing the study, and we get rid of their names and things of that nature as well. Imagine 5 years later you open up and read a book, and there you are in the book, or some journal article somewhere 5 years later, and you have been mischaracterized and misrepresented. I think that's a problem, and I think as researchers, I have an ethical obligation to protect the people who have been in my study. And after I spend a year in somebody's classroom, I mean, they're part of my family now, right? Access. I was involved in helping develop some of the guidelines for the TalkBank project. Anybody know about TalkBank? TalkBank was a project that Brian McWhinney at Carnegie Mellon developed, and the idea was that we were all going to contribute videos of classrooms to this big corpus, and then we would be able to take ideas and check them across contexts, across data. Okay, interesting idea, except one problem. How do you understand any video of a classroom without understanding the broader context within which it exists? That's a big problem. So we wrote all sorts of guidelines, and in the end, the guidelines became so long and complex and difficult that it was really clear it couldn't be done. So one has to be very, very careful about this, and accessing it requires people to ask the question, are you able to bring an appropriate context to the understanding of this data? Last, fraud protection. Some of you may know that, maybe it was about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, an accusation was made that some of our most famous ethnographers and anthropologists didn't actually do the research that they said they did. Right? How do you prove that you actually were there? You better have some data. Right? And if you can make these accusations against Margaret Mead, sure enough, you can make them against David Bloom, right? If Margaret Mead isn't, you know who Margaret Mead is, right? Okay. I mean, if Margaret Mead isn't protected, right? The rest of us certainly aren't. So we need to do something to protect ourselves against accusations that we're perpetrating some kind of fraud, that we didn't actually do the research. By the same token, we also need the data, because at other times people will want to try to understand our interpretations and will want to double check our interpretations. And that's important as well, that it be there for people to do so. Okay, the Center for Video Ethnography and Discourse Analysis was set up to help, particularly this kind of research. It's funded by the Department of Teaching and Learning in the College of Education. It is funded by an anonymous private donation, not a government agency. Our main asset is that we have a server, and that server is not connected to any network, it's not wireless, and it must be used in the center itself. Why do we do that? Well, as you know, the OSU network gets hacked every other month, one way or another, and goes down for long periods of times while they try to undo it or set up another set of passwords or clean their data and lose yours in the process. So, so this server is a way where we can store our data and make sure that nobody can hack in. I mean, in order to hack in, you got to go to the center to use it, if you will. In the center, we have all sorts of software for the analysis and reanalysis of video data, but let me be very clear. Software by itself does not do analysis, people do analysis. So it's how people use it. You can use it wisely and thoughtfully, or you can use it stupidly. And we also have places there for people to look across projects, but because it's an embodied place, you have to come together physically to do so, and in which case people are bringing the context of production with them to understand this. Okay, so let me summarize what I've said. I've talked about the DMP tool as useful, but just the beginning. There are other considerations. I've talked about some background on the research that I've done. I've talked about the nature of video-enhanced ethnographic research, highlighting the importance of context. I've talked about the particular definition of data that we have as ethnographers. I've talked about the nature of our corpus of data, which is basically it's big, which fits with Ohio State, because everything at Ohio State is big, right? I've talked about the fact that while I think about storage as interpretation, I've talked about some of the ethical considerations which focus on primarily the notion of context and ensuring appropriate context. And I've shared with you something about the center and why the center is important for the sort of data management that we do in Ethnographic. So with that, I thank you. Machine.
And we'll have a chance to ask Dr. Bloom questions at the end. So Kim, go ahead.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah, okay. My name is Kim Murphy, and I'm a doctoral student at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. And my work there involves working on a project and doing data management, data cleaning. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And I will be focused from a quantitative data point of view. Okay, so I will be talking about quality assurance practices under that sort of data management point of view. So some parallels to what Dr. Bloom was talking about as well, except like I said, from a quantitative point of view. And the study that I'm working on is called the Language and Reading Research Consortium. It's a large, multi-site, 5-year longitudinal research study, and we are doing direct assessments with children primarily, but we also have some questionnaires and classroom observations. So basically we have a lot of assessors who go out into the field for us and assess the kids, and then the sites send the data back to us. So they're collecting assessments on kids' language skills and reading skills. So when I talk to you today, I'll sort of be talking to you within the framework of what my experiences are with LARC, but hopefully you can draw parallels to what you're doing in your work where things are not exactly the same, but I think the big picture will still be relevant. Okay, so one of the things we joke about in this study is that one of the researchers always said, you know, he just thought we would put data in and get data out, and it did not happen that way. I mean, this was a big, big project. You probably know who I'm talking about. And so, you know, to get good quality data out at the end requires a lot of work. So the data in piece, and actually I've got a little reference there. I apologize for not having handouts. I kind of missed that. I should have sent those, but they will be available on the website afterwards. So you'll be able to have access to that link. That's a document, a paper that I recommend you read if you're interested in that. So the data in part is kind of the planning and the data collection and the data entry. So all of those things that you need to be thinking about to ensure that you're going to have quality data at the end. So I'll talk through each of these. So the planning piece, like I said, is making sure that things go smoothly so that when you put the data in, it will be as clean as possible or as easy to clean as possible. You don't, you know, garbage in, garbage out. Don't put the garbage in. You can avoid that at all. So planning in advance is really important. It will minimize the errors that you have to deal with later. Okay, so some of the first steps, you need to choose your measures or your instruments, and if at all possible, it's ideal to choose ones that are already established and reliable so that you know they're going to work the way you think they're going to work. You need to think ahead and plan your method of data entry or capture, and what we used on LARC was teleform. So in the field, assessors fill in, you know, little bubbles on the forms, and then those get scanned back into us. But you need to think about what you're going to do there. And we pre-populate our forms with key information like the child ID, the teacher ID, the date of birth, so that that information doesn't get entered incorrectly later. So we have control over that. And then thinking about, you know, what your database is going to be, what software you're using. These are all things to think about, obviously, ahead of time. And even the method of scoring. So we have some scoring that happens out in the field, some post-scoring that happens, some computerized scoring that happens, depending on what the measure is. The other part of the planning, we developed protocols for everything. We actually even have a protocol for protocols. I found that document once. Got a good laugh over that. But you really need to think through all of these things ahead. How are you going to assign participant IDs? You know, how long do they need to be? What information do you need to capture in there? How are you going to track changes in participant IDs over time? And then variable name is this whole other thing. We have a variable naming protocol. We need to be consistent across all the measures that we use, and really even across studies. If we're consistent, that helps. You want to make sure you've got information in your variable name about the measure itself, about the time point that it was measured, about the type of variable it is. You know, is it an item level? Is it some sort of sum score or calculated score? So all that's captured in the variable name itself. So having consistency and clarity in that's really important. And then we also have rules for dealing with missing data. We have separate codes, so if data is missing for one reason versus another reason, we've got different codes for that. And then we also have rules for each measure, so we will accept up to a certain amount of missing data for a child on a certain measure. We decided all of that ahead of time. And then rules for administration and scoring of the measures. We developed administration protocols, we developed scoring protocols, we had to think about basals and ceilings and start points and all kinds of things for each one of our measures. And assessor training, we planned that in advance. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But that's extremely important because we're sending these people out into the field to collect our data for us. And then tracking the data entry, how are we going to keep track of what's been sent in to us from the other sites? Of course, a plan for data cleaning and error logs, all that sort of stuff. So basically, you want standardized procedures across, especially if you have multiple sites, across multiple data collection sites. Codebooks and data dictionaries are two documents that we have that are really critical to quality assurance process, getting quality data. Codebooks record a lot of the information about our measures, you know, the full name of the measure, which version we may have used. We keep specific information if we modified, we track any changes or decisions about the measure, so all of that is in one document. And then the data dictionary is lists of the variable names and what they mean, what measures they are, and the values, all that sort of thing, so that if a statistician or even yourself down the road, you don't remember, if somebody picks that up, you know what all those variables are. And then the other really, really important thing was communication, especially for us. We were a big study across multiple sites. We had several teams even here within OSU, so the communication piece is really important. So that's something to plan for in advance. Okay, so I said I would talk about the assessor training. Developing clear materials and test them out. You know, we found out afterwards that sometimes we had one wording in one document but different wording in another document, so then assessors interpret things differently. And so to implement the training, we provide the assessors with all the materials that they need, and it's sort of a multi-pronged approach to training them. We give them the protocols, but you know, we've got PowerPoints and videos, and we do quizzes, and they've got to do a mock administration. So we want to make sure that our assessors are going to be administering these measures with fidelity. And there's some interesting research on assessment fidelity if you're interested in that, but really there's a lot of variance can be accounted for just by assessors potentially not administering correctly or administering differently from each other. So that's something you want to control for. Okay, so moving into the data collection part of this, the key obviously is accuracy. And you want to monitor the data collection. You don't want to just send off your army of assessors or your handful of students and assume that data collection is going the way you think it's going to go. So you really want to monitor that and keep an eye on it. And then this recalibration of assessors. So we made sure every year that the assessors went through training again. We put through PowerPoints to say, hey, here's some of the errors that we have found in the data. These are some things that you guys need to pay a little bit more attention to. So we were really careful to recalibrate the assessors over time. So that's really important. And this idea of minimizing missing data. You want to make sure that the people out in the field are getting to as many of the kids as they possibly can. You don't want to end up with a lot of missing data. So here's one place where you can actually have a little control over that. So if you're monitoring what's going on, you have that opportunity to minimize that. Then when we get to data entry, again, accuracy is really, really, really important. We like for the sites, whoever's doing the data collection, to check the actual forms before they send them to us. And then once we take it in, we go through a verification process. our teleform system has that sort of built into it, but even if you're sitting down and just hand entering data, have some sort of double checking process for that to decrease errors. And like I said, keeping track of what's being entered is important so you don't get lost and not sure what you put in or what you haven't. And again, here you can work to minimize any missing data by keeping track. Did they send that to us? If they didn't, we go back and we ask them for it. Okay, data cleaning. So this is what I spend a lot of my time doing. And please don't skip this step, the little smiley face, because trust me, you do not want to analyze dirty data. That is just a nightmare. And I think a lot of people don't realize how important this step is and how involved it can be. But clean data is a necessary element of high quality data output at the end of your study. And it will save you a lot of time and heartache. So clean all the data. All right, so the cardinal rule is to know your data. The person who's doing the data cleaning needs to be intimately familiar with all the measures. They need to know what these variables are. They need to know what was going on when the assessor and the child were together having this measure administered. You need to know what types of questions they were, the relationships between the variables. You need to know the ranges, are there ceilings and basals and all that sort of thing. So the code book comes in really handy here. So anybody who's cleaning a data set really needs to know that code book well. If you don't know what those variables are, you don't really know if you've got mistakes in there. Some other really key points of data cleaning is saving your original file always in a separate place and then working on a different version of the file, because it's easy to mess things up. And when you make decisions about fixing errors or making changes, just be consistent in how you do that. So if you make one type of decision for one measure, then that decision applies across measures. We will accept this type of assessor error, or we will not, or we will leave this as missing data, or we will fix it. Whatever you decide, just be consistent, and then track all those changes and decisions in your code books. Especially because some measures are just a lot more complex, and we've realized that too, that some measures are very easy to clean, some just give us big headaches. Okay, the other thing to keep in mind is that errors can happen in every step of the process. So when you're cleaning the data, you need to look at every possible type or every place where errors can happen. It can happen in the data collection where the assessor incorrectly administers the measure. It could be the actual data entry, the capturing of the data into your database. It could be in the scoring. So when I'm cleaning a data set, I make sure, even though we use computerized coding for the scoring, I still have to check that. So I will hand check, or I will use syntax within SPSS or whatever. Another point is looking at those original forms and comparing what's in the data set. So what you put in, is that what came out? So sometimes when we fill in those little bubbles, maybe the bubbles weren't filled in dark enough. So we do sort of like a data audit to make sure what's on those paper forms is actually what shows up in our data set. So that takes a little bit of time as well. Checking for duplicates, duplicate entries, confirming ID lists, were there any errors in how that was entered over time. And then you get to the point of actually looking at the numbers. So we do things like running descriptives, checking frequencies, distributions, all that sort of thing. I'll check it usually on the full sample, but also on subsets. I'll check it by grade, or even ranges, like I'll look at high scores and low scores and see if calculations are working within there. We look for outliers. If we see outliers, we'll go back to the original form and see, was this legitimate data or not? So we check all those things. We also have to check if those administration rules were correctly administered. So the basal, child has to get a certain number correct in a row before moving on. Was that administered correctly? And basically, it's a lot of just looking for unexpected patterns, things that kind of don't make sense based on your knowledge of the measure and how you think this data is going to work. And again, the missing data. So we will look at item level missing data. If a child seems to have a lot of items missing within a measure, I'll again go back to that original teleform and look, was this really missing, or what's going on here? And then overall, we want to have, our goal is to have overall less than 2% missing data that we will, if there's more than that, we will go back out to the sites to try to track down that missing data. So we keep a close eye on that. Here's a resource that I found, a really great website, and this is a link for some SAS code for checking some of the data, like the ranges and outliers and things like that. So if you're used to using SAS, you can just use some of that code to check those things a little bit more quickly. And then data cleaning from a broader view. So we have a whole bunch. We've got 30 different data sets for each year of our study, and so we also take a broader view. We want to look at consistency and relations across measures. So I don't just clean this measure and forget about it. We look at correlations between related measures. Are these data sort of looking the way we expect them to across different measures of similar constructs, for example? And then also across time points. So we're looking at descriptives. In the first time point, what mean did we get on the first graders? If we look at that again in the next year, do we have practice effects? Are there different things going on there? So we keep an eye on that as well. And this is really an iterative process, and it can get frustrating at times. We identify an error, we fix it. So I'll send it to the tech team, ask them to fix it. They come back and say, all right, it's fixed, and I've got to go back in and I check to make sure that it's fixed. And then we just sort of keep going back and forth. We might find more errors. Sometimes they're errors that you can fix. Sometimes it's things that you just have to say, well, this was an error out in the field, for example, that we don't know what this data should be, so we leave that as missing data. But when you identify the error, it's sort of this back and forth process. And then when we sort of feel like, okay, this data set is as clean as I can possibly get it, we have a final review. Somebody who's never cleaned that data set, look at it and give a review. So we send it out to the original site not the site who sent it in. Each site was responsible for certain measures. So we will then take that data and send it back to the owning site and say, you have to give final sign off on this measure that it's clean and functioning the way we expect it to. So we added that extra element. And all this, like I said, is really about ensuring that what you get at the end is quality data as much as we possibly can. So that when you get to this data out part, the data out at the end, once your database has done what it needs to do and you've cleaned your data set, then you can prepare to analyze your data. Like I said, you don't want to do it. You don't want to skip that middle step. So analyzing the data and sharing the data. So as we've heard, you're going to be more and more responsible for having your data available for other people. And so that becomes even more critical to document all your things and make sure that your data set is clean and high quality. And some of the things that we do, we really want to make sure we have our data sets set up in such a manner that they're user-friendly. So we want things well organized, we want values included, we want the variable labels included. People have access to the master ID list with the kids and the date of births and all that. We've got demographic information, and we merge our data sets. So we will have, like I said, 30 or 40 data sets per year, but then we actually take those and merge them all together year by year. We may do different versions of merging, but we will sort of do that on our end to make it easier once we share the data. So again, less chance for error. Item level data sets are available, plus these overall merged data sets that have sort of just those key or summary variables for the measures. And then we also make sure that the code books and the data dictionaries are available. So everything that the current research team might need or future research teams, we're sort of organizing this all in one place where all that information is available so that people don't pick up the data and, like Dr. Bloom said, use it out of context or not really knowing what the data is. So we want everything to be available and everything's user-friendly so that we can share our data well. And then, as Amanda will talk about as well, then there's those issues around accessibility. How are people going to get that data? How are we going to archive the data? Security of the data, all that sort of fun stuff. And then you can proceed, of course, with your data analysis and have fun once you've taken care of all these things. All right. I feel like I was very speedy.
You were very speedy.
I've got lots of other things I could talk about if there are questions, though.
Well, so I have a question, Kim. In terms of sharing, who is able to use this data right now? Is it just internal, or have you already started to share it past your researcher group?
as far as I know, we've mostly only had it within our group, or like the researchers, students at some of the other universities. I don't think we've had outside requests yet, and I'm not sure that we would be ready to. I don't know, actually, that might be even a question for Amanda. At what point are you expected to start sharing your data?
Right.
I will talk about that.
Okay. Well, any quick questions for Kim? We will have time at the end also to ask questions. Tanika, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this would be for Kim or later on for everyone else, so just let me know. I'm curious how much of this is included in the data management plan of the proposal versus the practices that are done.
And I think for us, it might not, I don't think we realized early on how much this data processing and data cleaning piece was going to take up. So I don't think all these details were included in an original plan. But I think we've all learned that if we were to do this in the future, that piece needs to be a pretty hefty chunk of what you're doing. So if you're, doing all this planning to set things up well, and then all the cleaning of the data and all that processing, we've learned, especially with a very large study like this across sites, it's a pretty hefty piece of your data management, and expensive too.
Well, I have reviewed NSF lots, and NSF allows you 3 pages for a data management plan. So with those 5 components or whatever, you can't put that kind of detail in but they are required for reviewers to look at those 3 pages. And people that have done a really good job and provided some detail in terms of, yes, we know we have to clean, we have to, those are the ones that really shine. I think at least the reviews that I've done, there are lots of, like a paragraph. Yes, we're going to collect data, we'll make it available, thank you very much. That's just not going to
Data
get you
in,
funded.
data out. It just doesn't happen that way.
That's right. So it is an important piece, at least, of the NSF proposals. So, but you only get 3 pages.
Okay. Hi, I'm back. So as I was listening to the other 2 presenters, my mind was getting full of all kinds of ways to draw what they're saying to what sort of the regulations are. So hopefully I'll remember enough I can kind of wrap it all together. I did want to throw up another life cycle. You're going to see 3 by the end of my slides, so I'll apologize in advance. This is actually a life cycle of a sponsored project. It is a schematic from our Office of Research. So we co-present in workshops sometimes, and what I like to put up is, if you think of the whole administrative portion of your funded research as a cycle as well, the data parts or the library parts that we can help with come in at the beginning and the end. So again, you're kind of looking at a sort of a disjunct in the cycle, but if you can pull it all together, it starts to make sense. In the beginning, you're planning for all this, right? And that's where the data management plan comes in, and you start asking yourself a lot of questions about what you intend to do, or at least the government's asking you those questions. At the end, you might want to share your data. Now, you might not want to share your data as well. But if you do want to share your data or archive your data or store your data, it's important to know what the differences between those words mean and what your options are. So I'll take us back to our original cycle here. Proposal planning and writing, so we're sort of at the beginning and we start working through the actual process. I thought it was great that some of our previous presenters talked a lot about what you do in the middle here. So we're missing our data cleaning step, sorry about that, but we can imagine it there. As well, Dr. Bloom pointed out that he's not sharing the data that he collects for very valid reasons to protect the human subjects. So if you imagine, he might not have the data sharing step here, but he might still be doing the archiving at the, I wrote it down, the Center for Video Ethnography and Discourse Analysis, right? So it's possible that as you get to the end of the cycle, your particular patterns are going to change a little bit. And they might actually change not just with the type of research you do, but sort of from project to project, or portions of your data can be shared, but other portions cannot. So this starts to rapidly get a little bit complicated. And so what usually happens is that you face something from the government that you might not be able to meet or you do not wish to meet. Someone asked, when do I have to share the data? So in the beginning with the NSF and the NIH, who were the first two to come out in 2003 and 2011 with the data management plan, they used nice vague language. They said, within a year of publication of the major findings. Well, what are major findings, right? So there was a lot of flexibility there. I was a little astonished in the last 6 months that a lot of them are getting quite a bit more stringent about when they want you to share the data. And I feel like this puts a lot of pressure on researchers to have that data prepared, have it organized, have the metadata, which is the code books, the data dictionaries, all of that clean and ready to go out there, maybe before they really should let it loose. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out and get help with this. Ideally, you have someone hired who's managing your data who can give you a timeline. As well, you can always negotiate somewhat in these data management plans. You can always, as long as you can justify your argument, you can do just about anything you want. I always say there's always a way to get there, but you have to give a rational reason to the review board for why you need to do it that way. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on some last sort of definitions, and then we'll open the floor and we can talk about whatever you want. It's very common when I'm helping faculty that they get some terms kind of conflated. Storage. So data storage is just sort of like, what drive do you have it on? So it can be a server, it can be anywhere. It is files somewhere. It could be a filing cabinet, it can be in print. Archiving and preservation have actual definitions about how long will these things live on their own under these conditions. How many of you know how long a file will last if you don't touch it? An electronic file, let's say on a jump drive, on a flash drive. How long do you think that's reliable? It does depend on if you lose it, yes. I'm going to assume that it's not good practice, yay! Jump drives are typically reliable about a year. They get knocked around too much. What about a CD or a DVD? You've burned it now to disk. Okay, 3 years. It's a little bit longer unless you live in the South. Having worked in the South for many years, discs go bad really, really fast if you leave them in your car in the hot sun. 125 degrees is when they melt. It's not that hard in Florida to get to 125 degrees in a car. So servers, okay, they're way more reliable, right? Because presumably someone has put it in a safe place that's not going to get flooded, that has some protection. So if you left it on a server indefinitely without touching it, how long do you think it would last? This is always a fun game because there's no real answer. So everything actually does degrade over time, even files. There's this thing that is colloquially known as bit rot. Has anyone ever heard of bit rot? Okay. Bit rot is basically the degradation of electronic files. There is a percentage rate at which electronic files break down. It is very slow if you have it under very ideal conditions. Your electronic, your digital, is always going to literally rot faster than paper kept appropriately. So if you have something that is terrifically important to you, and I mean really terrifically important, I still advise print it out and put it in a nice, low humidity, low light space. Now, video isn't going to print particularly well. So there are certain formats, of course, that aren't going to do this. This is a lot of what I talk about when I talk about actively managing your data. What are you going to keep? How are you going to keep it? Under what conditions? When people talk about archiving and preservation, they mean that you're not just going to store it someplace. You're going to have activities that make sure that it doesn't rot. So there's something called a checksum, and there's little programs that go along, and they check the size of your file. And if the size changes, they go get a backup. And these checksum programs enable this to be properly archived and preserved over time. So this gets kind of complicated and a lot to do on an individual basis. So storage and archive and preservation are two separate things. They might be the same thing if you're working with a company or someone who does both, but just be aware of that. And sharing and access you might have with storage. That's our Dropbox, right? Dropbox does not do archival preservation techniques. You might have an archive, a preservation system that also has access, or it might not have access. These are three different things that you're commonly going to be asked in a data management plan, and just understanding the subtle differences can help you respond. Now, if you don't want to handle all this yourself, and I certainly don't want to handle it myself for my work, I strongly recommend, if you want to share your data, to find a reputable repository. Who here is familiar with ICPSR? Oh, okay, a couple of people. ICPSR is a data repository that started in 1963, back on old magnetic tapes. It's a spin-off from the University of Michigan. It's one of the most reliable data repositories out there for social science data. It's also a really good place to go if you're teaching with data. They have a lot of modules on there and teaching, and as well, of course, to pull down data to use yourself. As well, they allow limited sharing. So if you're concerned about someone misusing your data, particularly if you're feeling a lot of pressure to share, you can put licensing around it that only lets it be used in specific ways. It's very common in ICPSR to run up against a wall, and it will say, this is not public data. You need to fill out an application. And you're going to fill out that application, you're going to answer questions, and they're going to judge whether you are meeting the criteria for receiving that data. So even if you share, you can build some things around it. There's always a way to sort of accomplish your goal. If you don't find ICPSR as something that you can use, it just happens to be one of the better ones. There is an index of international data repositories. It's re3data.org. If you pull it up, you can sort. I do not vouch for the quality of all those repositories, but if you want to find one and get some opinions on it, just ask any librarian. We're full of them. And there's about 900 in there so far. And last but not least, there's the knowledge bank. Has anyone here ever deposited anything in the knowledge bank? Oh, I see the cameraman has a, okay, we got some hands here. The knowledge bank is our institutional repository. It is completely open. So it does do archival preservation and storage, but it has completely public access. So if you want to put your information out there, certainly we have our own archival storage preservation system. We will accept data sets into it, but on a case-by-case basis. And this is largely because when we started this, it was for text material, and the system doesn't always handle all file types quite the same way. But definitely, if you find yourself in a position where you want to share openly, let us know, and we might be able to help you. And this is the last slide, I promise. Okay, so I really like life cycles. This is one that will not translate in a presentation because it's way too small. But if you want to see how all the various cycles of your research kind of intersect, the funding, the various entities, University of Central Florida put this together, and I think it's a really nice one. It kind of codes everybody out, all the people that might be able to help you. They did it to identify gaps on their campus in services so that they could sort of complete all these many services that are needed to effectively do research. So that's my favorite life cycle. And that's it for me. Do we have time for questions? How much does it cost to deposit into ICPSR? Funding models are very different for different data repositories. If you are a member at ICPSR, most deposits are free. That means the institution is paying a certain rate based on FTE. We are a member. So typically depositing social science or political science data there is free. Caveat to that is you want to contact them at the planning stage. The lovely thing is they assign you a human. So you fill out one brief form And if you don't go any further than that, they actually email you and call you and ask what's wrong. I know because I've done that. So it's lovely. They'll work with you one-on-one. If there are any fees, which for certain activities there can be, you can find that out up front and you can put it on your budget for your grant. So that's rather nice. I don't know if I can answer for sure, but I can tell you the state of how things work right now. So, correct me if I'm wrong. The question is, will the IRB folks be getting more involved with data management plans? And if so, what are the consequences of this? They certainly do not approve the plan. I do not believe they want to approve the plan. So the reason why I co-teach with the IRB is because they already have a section on their application that talks about data management. And what we ran into is we have researchers telling the federal government one thing and telling the IRB a different thing. And then at the end of the research cycle, they come and they say, well, I want to put the data in the knowledge bank or wherever. And we go, you didn't consent your people. You have to tell them what you're going to do with their data. Or you told the IRB you were going to keep it completely confidential. Obviously, the responsibility is always with the PI. However, ethically, I could not recommend that. So that puts the faculty member in a bind if they don't match what they're telling the federal government with what they're telling the IRB board. In a way, you're doing double reporting. The workflow for data management plans right now. So you, as a faculty member, you fill this out. You submit it through whatever your department or college system is. It's part of your proposal. I think they're technically institutional data. However, particularly here at ISU, I do know they are completely confidential. So I would love to know what people put in their data management plans, right? So I can develop services to improve and reach out and know if people are using repositories. I would have to consent each of you to get access to your data management plan as part of a research study. I don't know if the IRB board can pull up your plans, but I don't think they're interested in it because they already ask you about that. I don't think the IRB compliance board is interested in your data management plans because they already ask you about it. That's my best guess. I do know that all the comments on your data management plans only go back to you. So there's no way for anyone else to know what's going on with that particular aspect of your proposal unless you reach out and share that information. So. Data repositories for NIH or health services. There are several of them. NSF and NIH both contribute funds to different what we call disciplinary or third-party repositories. The most popular, largest is NCBI, so the National Center for Biotechnology Information. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. do. Yeah, they do. That's good job because everything like the data dictionary and the code books and how you did the analysis, all of that can be considered metadata, which is typically about 20% of your data management plan. So they want to see the documentation of how the data was treated. Now, again, this is a 2 or 3 page plan, so you're not getting super deep there, but most data repositories like ICPSR, they're going to have they're not going to accept the data unless there's a code book with it. The whole point is making this reusable for another human, right? Um, so storage is just my files that might have absolutely no information on what these things mean. Archive and preservation and sharing has all the metadata surrounding it. And this tends to be a big challenge for researchers moving into this field. So a lot of the people that end up in my office are ones that are having difficulty meeting the federal requirements. So I would recommend absolutely think about it beforehand. If it's not straightforward to you about what you can do with your data, or if you're not comfortable with it, please, please come talk to me. Because we can look at what's standard in your particular field. Quite frequently, what comes out of the data management plans that I consult on is that they're not going to share for very valid reasons. They're not going to share for homeland defense, for commercialization, absolutely. It's more about due diligence than about sharing.